In the genre of painting, watercolor is such a beautiful medium to represent various landscapes. And in the case of a mountainous range, we'll find that the watercolor medium does really well in terms of creating this layering effect to establish a realistic sense of depth and can be utilized in a way to make really beautiful landscape artworks. With that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another tutorial by Art in Context, where we explore various art related topics. And in today's tutorial, I'll be teaching you how to paint some mountains in watercolor. So with that being said, let's get started. Now we will want to make sure we have some watercolor, some good paper and some paintbrushes, but the way in which we're going to start is we want to first establish and set our page up on our surface area where we basically tape the page down, and we're going to start by painting the sky. Now naturally with landscapes you always want to work from the background into the foreground, especially with a layering medium, in this case watercolor, and this is just going to effectively represent this quality of items or structures that seemingly become a little bit more dissipated as they shift towards the distance. Now we begin with our mountainous watercolor scenario by painting the background, and this means that we'll be painting the sky first as we wait for the sky to fall behind our mountainous range. So we start by basically priming the surface of the page with a thin layer of water, and we can begin by painting the sky using our lightest color first. So this is where you can think about your color values and what type of color values you would like to be present within your mountainous landscape. In this case, a good suggestion would be to maybe use something like a yellow, which we can then add darker colors over. A nice color to add to the sky usually is also red. Putting some red strokes in the sky can give some sort of definition in the sky, which could kind of gesture at clouds and cloud formation in the sky, and perhaps add some blue strokes within the sky as well. Again, skies are pretty abstract when it comes to this quality of a sunset and how it kind of represents color variation in the sky, so this gives us a lot of freedom to play around with color integration and choices in terms of what sits in the background within our sky. So play around with this, play around with color variations, but we do want to work whilst the surface area of the page is still wet, making sure that these transitions of colors are as seamless as possible once that paint is dry. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start painting the first mountain range. So we'll now begin to paint the various mountain ranges, and we do this by building up each one layer by layer, basically creating mountain range, allowing it to dry, then kind of adding in another dark mountain range and slowly building up various mountain ranges. Now we will proceed to paint our mountain range by filling in the part of the page that falls under the mountain ridge line that you have basically painted. So you want to establish that ridge line and then paint underneath it, and we don't necessarily need to bring the paint to the bottom of the page. However, we do want to make sure that the paint does kind of fill most of that structure that we've established with that mountainous shape. So try to keep your mix of this first mountain range quite light, again building up in layers and eventually moving to a darker tone. And we do this by starting with the lighter tone of blue first. In this case we'll use some blue because it kind of contrasts really well to the color variation we have chosen for the sky. The aim here is to make sure we keep our paint wet throughout the painting process of the whole mountain. Again, the reason for this is because we want to have an even dry surface once the paint has completely dried, allowing for the mountain to have a very seamless color composition without any strange color gradients or distinct lines. So make sure you paint toward the edges of the masking tape as you kind of paint towards the edges of the page. And once you are done with this first mountain range, you want it to dry completely before we move into the second mountain range. Now once our first mountain range has completely dried, we can now begin to slightly darken our already existing mix of blue, making a new mix where we basically have it slightly darker than the previous one. And once we have this, we can then begin to paint a line through our page indicating a new ridge of the next mountain range. Now with this next mountain range, we do want to try and keep it slightly below the first mountainous range. And as we continue, another good suggestion is to not paint it completely through the entire page. So perhaps begin on one side of the page and paint towards the center bottom section of the page, and by doing this we basically create a sense of height in our landscape, allowing the view to be depicted as one from a heightened vantage point. Like the previous step, once we have defined the ridge line, we can then fill in that entire structure. This time make sure you bring your paint to the bottom of the page. We want the mountain to seem like it extends beyond the frame of the painting. This creates a little bit more of a pleasing and realistic aesthetic for the view of the mountains. And again, we want to build up this quality of depth with these darker qualities and with the shape and the color variation and filling in the entire frame. Now lastly, make sure that the paint is wet throughout this process. filling in the whole mountain with your darker mix of blue, and this is so that once the paint has dried, it has a more seamless look once again without any strange marks or lines going through that mountainous structure. But otherwise, once we have done that, we can allow it to dry completely once again before moving on to painting our last mountainous range. And we will now do the same for the last mountainous range by starting with a darker blue. Once again, we want to make sure the blue is at its darkest point this time, as this mountain range will now sit in the foreground. So this should be the darkest blue, as each mountain range should basically be darker than the last. And we can begin by painting a smaller mountain range beginning on the opposite side of the page from the last mountain range. Now try to keep this last mountain range slightly smaller, again each one being smaller as we shift towards the foreground, and by doing so we create a nice sense of distance and depth from the closest to the furthest mountain. Watercolor mountains do well with layers both in color and size variation, so this is where we want to think about the composition and how naturally our color gradients shift from these lighter tonal values to darker ones, but also the scale of these various mountainous structures shift from larger ones to smaller ones, ultimately establishing this quality of depth in a more realistic way. And then lastly, make sure you are filling in the whole mountain with an even distribution of paint, and we want to do this with all the mountains, painting the color wet onto the page and allowing for the whole mountain to dry evenly. Once we have done that, we're going to now further contextualize the painting by creating a little bit of a forest in the foreground. So once all our mountain ranges have completely dried, we can now play around with contextualizing the scene with something interesting in terms of feature, and this is where we can start creating something like a forest in the foreground. So basically, once all of the mountain ranges have completely dried, we can move on to contextualizing the landscape with some trees in the foreground. So perhaps use a dry brush with some black paint to create a little bit more of a non-wet type of mark. So we want to use black because at this point the trees will sit in the foreground of the image, and the closer the object, the darker they should be. This creates a good sense of depth in the image, and again, this is just an effective way to keep consistency in that quality of depth in terms of the lighter dissipated color values in the distance and then the darker vivid color values in the foreground. So you can proceed to make these little dabbing marks around those vertical lines, so you can establish those vertical lines, create these dabbing marks. However, try to keep a set of marks that define almost like an arrowhead shape, which again gives the impression of pine trees. In this case, we can kind of emphasize the quality and the silhouette of pine trees. Making pine trees also works well with a mountainous landscape because it's often associated with this kind of forest landscape, which is obviously associated with a mountainous landscape. So you can proceed to paint one or two more trees to give a sense of variety. A good suggestion would be to paint different sizes, which does give a sense of variation and distance at which the trees are located, and this also helps to create a little bit more depth in the image, allowing for the landscape to seem slightly more expansive. And then guys, lastly, once we have completely allowed for the painting to dry, we can then proceed to remove the tape, and there you have it, watercolor mountains done in a very simple and easy way. This is a great and easy way to learn how to paint mountains and can be utilized in so many ways in terms of representing a little bit more of a realistic sense of depth and playing around with what you establish in the foreground in terms of what kind of landscape you would like to represent. Watercolor does really well with this concept of layering, and in the case of a mountainous landscape, it's really fun to understand how representing these lighter tonal values and shapes in the distance can create that quality of depth, and as we shift towards the foreground, we can really make those details slightly more darker and therefore more vivid, and emphasizing that quality of scale and expansion within the landscape. But otherwise guys, some key things to think about: always work from background to foreground, always make sure you work whilst the page is still wet in terms of filling in these various tonal values of mountains. Again, mountains are obviously abstract, so you can play around with the shape and ridge of various mountains, and then build up your tonal values from lighter tones to darker as you shift towards the foreground, and then ultimately play around with what you would like to represent in the foreground. In this case, we demonstrated how to paint some trees, but that you can play around with and kind of utilize these concepts and skills and apply them to your own artworks and landscapes. If you did like this video and are interested in similar or related topics in terms of representing certain natural scenes and spaces through the watercolor medium or various other mediums, please do let us know in the comment section below. We'd love to hear back from you guys, and also please show your support by liking and subscribing. That helps us to continue making more artwork, which we love to do and love to share with you guys, so please do like and subscribe. Otherwise, thanks again for tuning in. That is it from me today. Until next time, see you in the next video. Cheers.